"Get up, you baby, you're okay," he said, and carefully came to a sitting position. Twinges from his back, but nothing worse. Just shaken up. Nothing hurt but your fucking pride, as they used to say. Still, he'd maybe sit here another minute or so. He was making a great time, and he deserved a rest. Besides, those memories had shaken him. Richie Granado, fucking Richie Granado, who had, it turned out, flunked off the football team. It hadn't been the broken nose at all. "Gonna see you fellas again," he had told them, and Henry guessed he had meant it. But the threatened confrontation had never happened. No, never happened. Something else had happened instead. And all that was long time ago. Right now, Banbury Cross awaited, hole in the wall at least, and he had no cock-horse to ride here. Only that poor man's steed, Shank's mare. Henry got to his feet, began to brush snow from his ass, and then someone screamed inside his head. "Ow! Ow! Ow!" he cried. It was like something played through a Walkman if you turned up to concert hall levels, like a shotgun blast that had gone off directly behind his eyes. He staggered backward, flailing for balance, and he had not run into the stiffly jutting branches of a pine growing at the left side of the road, he surely would have fallen down again. He disengaged himself from the tree's clutch, ears still ringing. Hell, his entire head was ringing. And stepped forward, hardly believing he was still alive. He raised one of his hands to his nose, and the palm of his hand came away wet with blood. There was something loose in his mouth, too. He held his hand under it, spat out a tooth, looked at it wonderingly, then tossed it aside, ignoring his first impulse, which had been to put it in his coat pocket. No one, as far as he knew, did surgical implants on teeth, and he strongly doubted that the tooth fairy came this far out in the boonies. He couldn't say for sure whose scream that had been, but he had an idea. Pete Moore had maybe just run into a big load of bad trouble. Henry listened to other voices, other thoughts, and heard none. Excellent. Although he had to admit that, even without his voices, this had certainly turned into the hunting trip of a lifetime. "Go, big boy! On you, huskies!" he said, and started running toward the hole in the wall again. His sense that something had gone wrong there was stronger than ever, and it was all he could do to hold himself to a last jog. "Go look in the chamber pot. Why don't we just knock on the bathroom door and ask him how he is?" Had he actually heard those voices? Yes, they were gone now, but he had heard them. Just as he had heard the terrible agonal scream. Pete? Or had it been the woman? Pretty Becky Shue? "Pete," he said, the word coming out in a puff of vapor. It was Pete. Not entirely sure, even now, but pretty sure. At first he was afraid he wouldn't be able to find his rhythm again, but then, while he was still worrying about it, it came back. The synchronicity of his hurrying breath and thudding feet, beautiful in its simplicity. 3 more miles to Banbury Cross, he thought, going home, just like we took Dedits home that day. "If you tell anybody I did this, I will never chum with you guys again." Henry returned to that October afternoon as to a deep dream. He dropped down the well of memories so far, so fast, that at first he didn't sense the cloud rushing toward him. The cloud that was not words or thoughts or screams, but only its red-black self. A thing with places to go and things to do. Beaver steps forward, hesitates for a moment, then drops to his knees. The retard doesn't see him. He's still wailing, eyes squeezed shut and narrow chest heaving. Both the Underoos and Beaver's zipper-studded old motorcycle jacket are comical, but none of the other boys are laughing. Henry only wants the retard to stop crying. That crying is killing him. Beaver shuffles forward a bit on his knees and then takes the weeping boy into his arms. Baby's boat a silver dream, sailing near and far. Henry has never heard Beaver sing before, except maybe along with the radio. The Clarendons are most certainly not churchgoers, and he is astounded by the clear tenor sweetness of his friend's voice. In another year or so, Beaver's voice will change completely and become unremarkable. But now, in the weedy, vacant lot behind the empty building, it pierces them all, astounds them. The retarded boy reacts as well, stops crying, and looks at Beaver with wonder. It sails from here in baby's room and to the nearest star. Sail, baby, sail, sail on home to me. Sail the seas and sail the stars, sail on home to me. The last note drifts on the air, and for a moment, nothing in the world breathes for beauty. Henry feels like crying. The retarded boy looks at Beaver, who has been rocking him back and forth in rhythm with the song. On his teary face is an expression of blissful astonishment. He has forgotten his split lip and bruised cheek, his missing clothes and his lost lunchbox. To Beaver he says, "War." Open syllables that could mean almost anything, but Henry understands them perfectly and sees Beaver does too. "I can't do more," the Beav says. He realizes his arm is still around the kid's shirtless shoulders and takes it away. As soon as he does, the kid's face clouds over, not with fear this time, or with the petulance of one balked of getting his way, but in pure sorrow. Tears fill those amazingly green eyes of his and spill down the clean tracks on his dirty cheeks. He takes Beaver's hand and puts Beaver's arm back over his shoulders. "War, war," he says. Beaver looks at them, panicked. "That's all my mother ever sang me," he says. "I always went right to fucking sleep." Henry and Jonesy exchange a look and burst out laughing. Not a good idea. It'll probably scare the kid and he'll start that terrible bawling again. But neither of them can help it. And the kid doesn't cry. He smiles at Henry and Jonesy instead. A sunny smile that displays a mouthful of white crammed together teeth. And then looks back at Beaver. He continues to hold Beaver's arms firmly around his shoulders. "War," he commands. "Oh, fuck, sing it again," Pete says. "The part you know." Beaver ends up singing it 3 more times before the kid will let him stop. We'll let the boys work him into his pants and his torn shirt, the one with Richie Granado's number on it. Henry has never forgotten that haunting fragment and will sometimes recall it at the oddest times. After losing his virginity at the UNH fraternity party with smoke on the water pounding through the speakers downstairs, after opening his paper to the obituary page and seeing Barry Newman's rather charming smile above his multiple chins, feeding his father, who had come down with Alzheimer's at the ferociously unfair age of 53, his father insisting that Henry was someone named Sam. "A real man pays off his debts, Sammy," his father had said, and when he accepted the next bite of cereal, milk ran down his chin. At these times, what he thinks of Beaver's lullaby will come back to him and he will feel transiently comforted. No bounds, no play. Finally, they've got the kid all dressed except for one red sneaker. He's trying to put it on himself, but he's got it pointing backward. He's one fucked up young American, and Henry is at a loss to know how the 3 big boys could have bullied up on him. Even aside from crying, which was like no crying Henry had ever heard before. Why would you want to be so mean? "Let me fix that, man," Beaver says. "Fit what?" the kid asks, so comically perplexed that Henry, Jonesy and Pete all burst out laughing again. Henry knows you're not supposed to laugh at retards, but he can't help it. The kid just has a naturally funny face, like a cartoon character. Beaver only smiles. "Your sneaker, man." "Fit sneak?" You can't put it on that way, fucking impossible, senor." Beaver takes the sneaker from him, and the kid watches with close interest as the Beav slips his foot into it, draws the laces firmly against the tongue, and then ties the ends in a bow. When he's done, the kid looks at the bow for a moment longer, then at Beaver. Then he puts his arms around Beaver's neck and plants a big, loud smack on Beaver's cheek. "If you guys tell anybody he did that," Beaver begins, but he's smiling, clearly pleased. Yeah, you'll never chum with us again, you fucking wank," Jonesy says, grinning. He has held onto the lunchbox and now squats in front of the kid, holding it out. "This yours, guy?" The kid grins with the delight of someone encountering an old friend and snatches it.
"Ooby-dooby-doo, where are you?" he sings. "We got some work to do now."
That's right, Jonesy agrees. Got some work to do now. Gotta get you the fuck home is what we got to do. Douglas Kivell, that's your name, right? The boy holding his lunchbox to his chest in both of his dirty hands. Now he gives it a loud smack, just like the one he puts on Beaver's cheek.
"I did it!"
he cries. Good, Henry says. He takes one of the boy's hands, Jonesy takes the other, and they help him to his feet. Maple Lane is only 3 blocks away, and they can be there in 10 minutes. Always assuming that Richie and his friends aren't hanging around and hoping to ambush them. Let's get you home, Dadits. Bet your mom's worried about you. But first, Henry sends Pete to the corner of the building to look up the driveway. And when Pete comes back and reports the coast clear, Henry lets them go that far. Once they are on the sidewalk where people can see them, they'll be safe. Until then, he will take no chances. He sends Pete out a second time, tells him to scout all the way to the street, then whistle if everything is good.
"They're gone,"
Duddit says. Maybe, Henry says. But I'll feel better if Pete takes a look. Duddit stands serenely among them, looking at the pictures on his lunchbox, while Pete goes out to look around. Henry feels okay about sending them. He hasn't exaggerated Pete's speed. If Richie and his friends try to jump him, Pete will turn on the jets and leave them in the dust. "You like this show, man?" Beaver says, taking the lunchbox. He speaks quietly. Henry watches with some interest, curious to see if the retarded boy will cry for his lunchbox. He doesn't.
"Ooby-doos,"
the retarded kid says. His hair is golden curly. Henry still can't tell what age he is. "I know they're Scooby-Doos," the Beav says patiently, "but they never changed their clothes. Pete right about that. I mean, fuck me Freddy, right?"
"E.T."
He holds out his hands for the lunchbox and Beaver gives it back. The retarded boy hugs it, then smiles at them. It is a beautiful smile, Henry thinks, smiling himself. It makes him think of how you are cold when you have been swimming in the ocean for a while, but when you come out you wrap a towel around your bony shoulders and goose pimply back, and you're warm again. Jonesy is also smiling. "Duddits," he says. "Which one is the dog?" The retarded boy looks at him, still smiling, but puzzled now too. "The dog," Henry says. "Which one's the dog?" Now the boy looks at Henry, his puzzlement deepening. "Which one's Scooby, Duddits?" Beaver asks, and Duddits' face clears. He points.
"Ooby-dooby-doo, a dog."
They all burst out laughing. Duddits is laughing too, and then Pete whistles. They start moving and have gone about a quarter of the way up the driveway when Jonesy says, "Wait, wait!" He runs to one of the dirty office windows and peers in, cups his hand to the sides of his face to cut the glare. And Henry suddenly remembers why they came. Tina Jean, what's her face? Pussy. All that seems about 1,000 years ago. After about 10 seconds, Jonesy calls, "Henry, Beav, come here, leave the kid there." Beaver runs to Jonesy's side. Henry turns to retarded boy and says, "Stand right there, Duddits, right there with your lunchbox, okay?" Duddits looks up at him, green eye shining, lunchbox held to his chest. After a moment he nods, and Henry runs to join his friends at the window. They have to squeeze together, and Beaver grumbles that someone is stepping on his fucking feet. After a minute or so, puzzled by their failure to show up on the sidewalk, Pete joins them, poking his face in between Henry and Jonesy's shoulder. Here are 4 boys at the dirty office window, 3 with their hands cupped to the sides of their faces to cut the glare, and the 5th boy standing behind them in the weedy driveway, holding his lunchbox against his narrow chest and looking up at the white sky, where the sun is trying to break through. Beyond the dirty glass, where they will leave clear crescents on the marks of places where their foreheads rested, is an empty room. Scattered across the dusty floor are a number of deflated white tadpoles that Henry recognizes as jizz bags. On one wall, The one directly across the window is a bulletin board. Tacked to it is a map of northern New England and a Polaroid photograph of a woman holding her skirt up. You can't see her pussy though, just some white panties. And she's no high school girl. She's old. She must be at least 30. Holy God! Giving Jonesy a disgusted look. We came all the way down here for that? For a moment, Jonesy looks defensive, then grins and jerks his thumb back over his shoulder. No! We came for him! Henry was pulled from recall by an amazing and totally unexpected realization. He was terrified. Had been terrified for some time. Some new thing had been hovering just below the threshold of his consciousness, held down by the vivid memory of meeting Duddits. Now it burst forward with a frightened yell, insisting on recognition. He skidded to a stop in the middle of the road, flailing his arms to keep from falling down in the snow again, and then simply stood there panting, eyes wide. What now? He was only 2.5 miles from hole in the wall, almost there. So what the Christ now? There's a cloud, he thought. Some kind of cloud, that's what. I can't tell what it is, but I can feel it. I've never felt anything so clearly in my life. My adult life, anyway. I have to get off the road. I have to get away from it, get away from the movie. There's a movie in the cloud. The kind Jonesy likes, a scary one. That's stupid, he muttered, knowing it wasn't. He could hear the approaching wasp whine of an engine. It was coming from the direction of hole in the wall and coming fast. A snowmobile engine, almost certainly the Arctic Cat stored at camp. But it was also the red-black cloud with the movie going on inside it. Some terrible black energy rushing toward him. For a moment, Henry was frozen, with 100 childish horrors, things under beds and things in coffins, squirming bugs beneath, overturned rocks, and the furry jelly that was the remains of a long-dead baked rat the time Dad had moved the stuff from the wall to check the plug. And horrors that weren't childish at all. His father, lost in his own bedroom and bawling with fear. Barry Newman, running from Henry's office with that vast look of terror on his face. Terror because he had been asked to look at something he wouldn't, perhaps couldn't, acknowledge. Sitting awake at 4 in the morning with a glass of scotch, all the world a dead socket. His own mind a dead socket. And oh baby, it was 1,000 years till dawn, and all lullabies had been cancelled. Those things were in the red-black cloud, rushing down on him, like the pale horse in the Bible, those things and more. Every bad thing he had ever suspected was now coming toward him. Not on a pale horse, but on an old snowmobile with a rusty cowling. Not death, but worse than death. It was Mr. Grey. Get off the road, his mind screamed. Get off the road now! Hide! For a moment he couldn't move. His feet seemed to grow heavy. The gash on his thigh, the one the turn signal had made, burned like a brand. Now he understood how a deer caught in the headlights felt, or a chipmunk hopping stupidly back and forth in front of an oncoming lawnmower. The cloud had robbed him of his ability to help himself. He was frozen in its rushing path. What got him going, oddly enough, was all those thoughts of suicide. Had he agonized his way to that decision on 500 sleepless nights only to be robbed of his option by a kind of buck fever? No, by God, no, it wouldn't be. Suffering was bad enough, allowing his own terrified body to mock that suffering by locking up and just standing here while a demon ran him down? No, he would not allow that to happen. And so he moved. But it was like moving in a nightmare, fighting his way through air that seemed to be grown as thick as taffy. His legs rose and fell with the slowness of an underwater ballet. Had he been running down this road, actually running? The idea now seemed impossible, no matter how strong the memory. Still, he kept moving while the whine of the approaching engine grew closer, deepening to a stuttery roar. And at last he was able to get into the trees on the south side of the road. He managed perhaps 15 feet, far enough so that there was no snow cover, only a dust of white on the aromatic, orange-brown needles. There, Henry fell on his knees, sobbing with terror and putting his gloved hands to his mouth to stifle the sound. Because what if it heard? It was Mr. Grey. The cloud was Mr. Grey, and what if it heard? He crawled behind the moss-girdled trunk of a spruce tree, clutched it, then peered through it through the tumbled screen of his sweaty hair. He saw a spark of light in the dark afternoon. It jittered, wavered and rounded. It became a headlight. Henry began to moan helplessly as the blackness neared. It seemed to hover his mind like an eclipse, obliterating though, replacing it with terrible things. Milk on his father's chin, panic in Barry Newman's eyes, scrawny bodies and eyes behind barbed wire, flayed women and hanged men. For a moment his understanding of the world seemed to turn inside out like a pocket, and he realized that everything was infected, or could be. Everything. His reasons for contemplating suicide were paltry in the face of this oncoming thing. He pressed his mouth against the tree to keep from screaming, felt his lips tattoo a kiss into the springy moss, all the way where it was moist and tasted of bark. In that moment, the Arctic cat flashed past, and Henry recognized the figure which straddled it. The person who was generating the red-black cloud which now filled Henry's head like a dry fever. He bit into the moss, screamed against the tree, inhaled fragments of moss without being aware of it, and screamed again. Then he simply knelt there, holding on to the tree and shuddering as the sound of the Arctic cat began to diminish into the west. He was still there when it had died away to a troublesome whine again. Still there when it faded away entirely. Pete's back there somewhere, he thought. It'll come to Pete and to the woman. Henry stumbled back to the road, unaware that his nose had been bleeding again, unaware he was crying. He began moving toward a hole in the wall once more, although now the best pace he could manage was a shambling limp. But maybe that was all right. But it was all over back at camp. Whatever the horrible thing that he had been sensing had happened. One of the friends was dead, one was dying, and one, God help him, had become a movie star. Beaver said it again. No Beaverisms now, just that bare Anglo-Saxon syllable you came to when you were against the wall, and had no other way to express the horror you saw. Oh, fuck, man, fuck! However much pain McCarthy had been in, he had taken time to snap on both of the switches just inside the bathroom door, lighting the fluorescent bars on either side of the medicine chest mirror and the overhead fluorescent ring. These threw a bright, even glare that gave the bedroom the feel of a crime scene photograph. And yet, there was a kind of a stealthy surrealism too, because the light wasn't quite steady. There was just enough flicker for you to know the power was coming from a Jenny and not through a line maintained by Derry and Bangor Hydroelectric. The tile on the floor was baby blue. There was only spots and splatters of blood on it near the door. But as they approached the toilet next to the tub, the splotches ran together and became a red snake. Scarlet capillaries had spread off from this. The tiles were tattooed with the footprints of their boots, which neither Jonesy or Beaver had taken off. On the blue vinyl shower curtain were 4 blurred fingerprints, and Jonesy thought, he must have reached out and grabbed at the curtain to keep from falling when he turned to sit. Yes, but that wasn't the awful part. The awful part was what Jonesy saw in his mind's eye. McCarthy, scuttling through the baby blue tiles with one hand behind him, clutching himself, trying to hold on. "Ah, fuck," Beaver said again, almost sobbing. "I don't want to see this, Jonesy, man, I can't see this." "You've got to." He heard himself speaking as if from a great distance. "We can do this, Beav. If we can face up to Richie Granadu and his friends that time, we can face up to this." "I don't know, man. I don't know." Jonesy didn't know. But he reached out and took Beaver's hand. Beav's fingers closed over his with panicky tightness, and together they went a step deeper into the bathroom. Jonesy tried to avoid the blood, but it was hard. There was blood everywhere, and not all of it was blood. "Jonesy," Beaver said in a dry, near whisper, "do you see that crud on the shower? Do you see that crud on the shower curtain?" Yes. Growing in the blurred fingerprints were the little clumps of reddish, golden mold like mildew. There was more of it on the floor, not the fat blood snake, but in the narrow angles of the grout. "What is it?" "I don't know," Jonesy said. "Same shit he had on the face, I guess. Shut up a minute." Then, "McCarthy? Rick?" McCarthy, sitting there on the toilet, made no response. He had, for some reason, put up his orange cap back on. The bill stuck off at a crooked, slightly drunken angle. He was otherwise naked. His chin was down on his breastbone in a parody of deep thought. Or maybe it wasn't a parody. Who knew? His eyes were almost closed. His hands were clasped primly together over his pubic thatch. Blood ran down the side of the toilet in a big sloppy paint stroke, but there was no blood on McCarthy himself, at least not as far as Jonesy could see. One thing he could see, the skin of McCarthy's stomach hung in two slack dewlaps. The look of it reminded Jonesy of something, and after a moment or two it came to him. It was how Carla's stomach had looked when she had delivered each of their 4 children. Above McCarthy's hip, where there was a little love handle, and some give it to the flesh, the skin was only red. Across the belly, however, it had split open in tiny wheals. If McCarthy had been pregnant, it would have been with some sort of parasite, a tapeworm or hookworm or something like that. Only there was stuff growing in the spilled blood, and what he had said as he lay there in Jonesy's bed with the blankets pulled up to his chin. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." This was one knock Jonesy wished he had never answered. In fact, he wished he had shot him. Yes, he saw more clearly now. He was hyped on the clarity that sometimes comes to the completely horrified mind, and in that state, wished he had put a bullet in McCarthy's before he saw the orange cap and the orange flagman's vest. It couldn't have hurt. It might have helped. "Stand at the door and knock on my ass," Jonesy muttered. "Jonesy, is he still alive?" "I don't know." Jonesy took another step forward and felt Beaver's fingers slide out of his, and Beav had apparently come as close to McCarthy as he was able. "Rick?" Jonesy asked in a hushed voice. A don't wake the baby voice. A viewing the corpse voice. "Rick, are you—" There was a loud, dank fart from beneath the man on the toilet, and the room immediately filled with an eye-watering aroma of excrement and airplane glow. Jonesy thought it a wonder that a shower curtain didn't melt. From the bowl there came a splash. Not the plop of turd dropping, at least Jonesy didn't think so. It sounded more like a fish jumping in a pond. "Christ almighty, the stink of it!" Beaver cried. He has the heel of his hand over his mouth and nose, and his words were muffled. "But if he can fart, he must be alive. Huh, Jonesy? He must still be—" "Hush!" Jonesy said in a quiet voice. He was astonished at his steadiness. "Just hush, okay?" And Beav hushed. Jonesy leaned in close. He could see everything. He could see everything. The small stipple of blood in McCarthy's right eyebrow, the red growth on his cheek, the blood on the plastic blue curtain, the joke sign, Lamar's thinking place, that had hung in here when the toilet was still of the chemical variety, and the shower had to be pumped up before it could be used. He saw the little gelid gleam from between McCarthy's eyelids and the cracks of his lips, which looked purple and liverish in this light. He could smell the noxious aroma of the past gas and could almost see that too, rising in the filthy dark yellow streamers like mustard gas. "McCarthy! Rick! Can you hear me?" He snapped his fingers in front of those nearly closed eyes. Nothing. He licked a spot on the back of his wrist and held it first in front of McCarthy's nostrils, then in front of his lips. Nothing. "He's dead, Beav," he said, drawing back. "Bullshit, he is," Beaver replied. His voice was ragged, absurdly offended, as if McCarthy had violated all rules of hospitality. "He just dropped a clinker, man. I heard it." "I don't think that was—" Beav stepped past him, bumping Jonesy's bad hip against the sink hard enough to hurt. "That's enough, fella," Beaver cried. He grabbed McCarthy's round, freckled, unmuscled shoulder and shook it. "Snap out of it! Snap!" McCarthy listed slowly tubward, and Jonesy had a moment when he thought Beaver had been right after all. The guy was still alive and trying to get up. Then McCarthy fell off the throne and into the tub, pushing the shower curtain ahead of him in a filmy blue billow. The orange hat fell off. There was a bony crack as the skull hit the porcelain, and then Jonesy and Beaver were screaming and clutching each other, the sound of their horror deafening in the little tile-lined room. McCarthy's ass was a lopsided full moon, with a giant bloody crater in its center, the site of some terrible impact, it seemed. Jonesy saw it for a second before McCarthy collapsed face down into the tub and the curtain floated back into its place, hiding him. But in that second, it seemed to Jonesy that the hole was a foot across. Could that be a foot? Surely not. In the toilet bowl, something splashed again, hard enough to splatter droplets of bloody water up onto the ring, which was also blue. Beaver started to lean forward to look in, and Jonesy slammed the lid down on the ring without even thinking about it. "No," he said. "No? No!" Beaver tried to get a toothpick out of his front pocket of his overalls, came up with half a dozen, and dropped them on the floor. They rolled across the bloody blue tiles like jackstraws. The Beav looked at them, then looked up at Jonesy. There were tears standing in its eyes. "Like duddits, man," he said. "What in God's name are you talking about? Don't you remember? He was almost naked too. Fucker snatched off his shirts and his pants, didn't leave him nothing but his underpants, but we saved him." Beaver nodded vigorously, as if Jonesy or some deep and doubtful part of himself had scoffed at this idea. Jonesy scoffed at nothing, although McCarthy didn't remind him in the slightest of duddits. He kept seeing McCarthy going over sideways into the tub, his orange hat falling off, the fatty deposits on his chest, the tits of easy living. Henry called them whenever he saw a pair underneath some guy's polo shirt wobbling. And then his ass turning up to the light, that harsh fluorescent light that kept no secrets but blabbled everything in the droning monotone. That perfect white man's ass, hairless, just starting to turn flabby and settle down on the backs of the thighs. He had seen 1,000 like it in various locker rooms where he had dressed and showered, was developing one himself, or he had until the guy had run him over, changing the physical configuration of his backside perhaps forever. Only he had never seen one like McCarthy's was now, one that looked like something inside had fired a flare or shotgun shell in order to what? There was another hollow splash from the toilet. The lid bumped up. It was as good an answer as any. In order to get out, of course. "Sit on that," Jonesy told Beaver. "Huh? Sit on it." Jonesy almost shouted it this time, and Beaver sat down on the closed lid in a hurry, looking startled. In no secret's flat-toned light of the fluorescence, Beaver's skin looked as white as freshly turned clay, and every fleck of black stubble was a mole. His lips were purple. Above his head was the old joke sign, Lamar's Thinking Place. Beav's blue eyes were wide and terrified. "I'm sitting, Jonesy, see?" "Well, I'm sorry, Beav, but you just sit there, all right? Whatever he had inside him, it's trapped. Got nowhere to go but the septic tank. I'll be back." "Where you going?" "'Cause I don't want you to leave me sitting in the shithouse next to a dead man, Jonesy. If we both run—" "We are not running," Jonesy said grimly. "This is our place and we are not running." Which sounded noble but left out at least one aspect of the situation. He was mostly just afraid the thing that was now in the toilet might be able to run faster than they could. A squiggle faster, or something. Clips from 100 horror films, Parasite, Alien, they came from within, ran through his mind at super speed. Carla wouldn't go to the movies with him when one of those was playing, and she made him go downstairs and use the TV in his study when he brought them home on tape. But one of those movies, something he'd seen in one of them, just might save their lives. Jonesy glanced at the reddish-gold, mildewy stuff growing on McCarthy's bloody handprint. Save their lives from the thing in the toilet. Anyway, the mildewy stuff. Who in the God's name knew? The thing in the bowl leaped again, thudding the underside of the lid, but Beaver had no trouble holding the lid down. That was good. Maybe whatever it was would drown in there, although Jonesy didn't see how they could count on that. It had been living inside McCarthy, hadn't it? It had been living inside old Mr. Behold, I stand at the door and knock for quite some time. Maybe the whole 4 days he had been lost in the woods. It had slowed the growth of McCarthy's beard, it seemed, and caused a few of his teeth to fall down. It had also caused McCarthy to pass gas that probably couldn't have gone ignored even in the politest of polite society. Farts like poison gas, to be perfectly blunt about it. But the thing itself had apparently been fine, lively, growing. Jonesy had a sudden vivid image of a wriggling white tapeworm emerging from a pile of raw meat. His gorge rose in a liquid chugging sound. "Jonesy!" Beaver started to get up. He looked more alarmed than ever. "Beaver, sit back down!" Beaver did, just in time. The thing in the toilet leaped and hit the underside of the lid with a hard, hollow rap. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Remember that Lethal Weapon movie where Mel Gibson's partner didn't dare to get off the crapper? Beaver said. He smiled, but his voice was dry and his eyes were terrified. "This is just like that, isn't it?" "No," Jonesy said, "because nothing's going to blow up. Besides, I'm not Mel Gibson, and you're too fucking white to be Danny Glover." "Listen, Beav, I'm going out to the shed." No way, don't leave me here all by myself." "Shut up and listen. There's a friction tape out there, isn't there?" "Yeah, hanging on the nail at least, I think." "Hanging on the nail, that's right. Near the paint cans, I think. A big fat roll of it." "I'm going to get that, then come back and tape the lid down. Then..." It leaped again, furiously, as if it could hear and understand. "Well, how do we know it can't?" Jonesy thought. When it hit the bottom of the lid with a hard, vicious thud, the beaver winced. "Then we are getting out of here," Jonesy finished. "On the cat?" Jonesy nodded, although he had in fact forgotten all about the snowmobile. "Yeah, on the cat, and we'll hook it up with Henry and Pete." "Quarantine, that's what the guy in the helicopter said. That must be why they haven't come back yet, don't you think? They must have got held by a..." Thud. Beaver winced, so did Jonesy. "By the quarantine." "That could be," Jonesy said. "But listen, Beav, I'd rather be quarantined with Pete and Henry than here, wouldn't you?" "Let's just flush it down," Beaver said. "How about that?" Jonesy shook his head. "Why not?" "Because I saw the hole it made getting out," Jonesy said. "And so did you. I don't know what it is, but we are not going to get rid of it by pushing a handle. It's too big." "Fuck!" Beaver slammed the heel of his hand against his forehead. Jonesy nodded. "All right, Jonesy, go get the tape." In the doorway, Jonesy paused and looked back. "And Beaver?" Beaver raised his eyebrows. "Sit tight, buddy." Beaver started to giggle. So did Jonesy. Jonesy in the doorway and the Beav sitting on the closed toilet seat snorting laughter. When Jonesy hurried across the big central room, still giggling, "Sit tight," the more he thought about it, the funnier it seemed, toward the kitchen door. He felt hot and feverish, both horrified and hilarious. Sit tight. Jesus Christ, bananas. Beav could hear Jonesy giggling all the way across the room, still giggling when he went out the door. In spite of everything, Beav was glad to hear that sound. It had already been a bad year for Jonesy, getting run over the way he had. For a while there at first, they'd all thought he was going to step out, and that was awful. Poor old Jonesy wasn't yet 38. Bad year for Pete, who'd been drinking too much. A bad year for Henry, who sometimes got a spooky absence about him that Beav didn't understand and didn't like. And now, he guessed, you could say it had been a bad year for Beaver Clarendon as well. Of course, this was only 1 in 365. But you just didn't get up in the morning thinking that by afternoon there'd be a dead guy laying naked in the tub and you'd be sitting on the closed toilet seat in order to keep something you hadn't even seen from. Nope, Beaver said. Not going there, okay? Just not going there. And he didn't have to. Jonesy would be back with the friction tape in a minute or two. 3 minute tops. The question was, where did he want to go until Jonesy returned? Where could he go and feel good? Duddits. Duddits, that's where. Thinking about Duddits always make him feel good, and Roberta. Thinking about her was good too, undoubtedly. Beav smiled, remembering the little woman in the yellow dress who had been standing at the end of the walk on Maple Lane that day. The smile widened as he remembered now she'd caught sight of them. She had called her boy the same thing. She had called him. "Duddits!" she cries. A little graying wren of a woman in a flowered print dress then runs up the sidewalk toward them. Duddits had been walking contentedly with his new friends, chattering away 6 licks to a minute, holding his Scooby-Doo lunchbox in his left hand and Jonesy's hand in his right, swinging it cheerfully back and forth. His gabble seemed to consist almost entirely of open vowel sounds. The thing which amazes Beaver the most about it is how much of it he understands. Now, catching sight of the graying birdie woman, Duddits lets go of Jonesy's hand and runs toward her. Both of them running, and it seems Beaver of some musical about a bunch of singers, the One Crips or One Craps or something like that. "Ah me! Ah me!" Duddits shouts exuberantly. "Mommy! Mommy! Where have you been? Where have you been, you bad boy? You bad boy, old Duddits!" They come together and Duddits is so much bigger. 2 or 3 inches taller, too. What Beaver winces, expecting the birdie woman to be flattened, the way Coyote is always getting flattened in the Roadrunner cartoons. Instead, she picks him and swings him around, his sneakered feet flying out behind him, his mouth stretched halfway up to his ears in an expression of joyful ecstasy. "I was just about to go in and call the police. You bad old late thing. You bad old lady." She sees Beaver and his friends and set her son down on his feet. Her smile of relief is gone as she steps toward them over some little girl's hopscotch grid. Crude as it is, Beaver thinks even that will always be beyond Duddits. The tears on her cheeks gleam in the glow of the sun that has finally broken through. "Uh-oh," Pete says. "We're gonna catch it." "Be cool," Henry says, speaking low and fast. "Let her rant, and then I'll explain." But they have misjudged Roberta Cavell, have judged her by the standard of so many adults who seem to view boys their age as guilty until proven innocent. Roberta Cavell isn't that way, and neither is her husband, Alfie. The Cavells are different. Duddits has made them different. "Boys," she says again. "Was he wandering? Was he lost? I've been so afraid to let him walk, but he wants so much to be a real boy." She gives Beaver's fingers a strong squeeze with one hand and Pete with the other. Then she drops them, takes Jonesy and Henry's hand, and gives them the same treatment. "Ma'am," Henry begins. Mrs. Cavell looks at Henry with fixed concentration, as if she's trying to read his mind. "Not just lost," she says. "Not just wandering?" "Ma'am," Henry tries again and then gives up any thought of disassembling. It is Duddits' green gaze looking up at him from her face, only intelligent and aware, keen and questioning. "No, ma'am," Henry sighs. "Not just wandering. Because usually he comes right home. He says he can't get lost because he sees the line. How many were there?" "Oh, a few." "Oh, a few," Jonesy says. He shoots a swift look at Henry. Beside them, Duddits has found a last few gone-to-seed dandelions on the neighbor's lawn and is down on his belly, blowing the fluff of them and watching it float away on the breeze. "A few big boys were teasing him, ma'am." "Big boys," Pete says. Again her eyes search them from Jonesy to Pete, from Pete to Beaver, then again back to Henry again. "Come up to the house with us," she says. "I want to hear all about it. Duddits has a big glass of Zorex every afternoon. It's a special drink. But I'll bet you guys would rather have iced tea, wouldn't you? The three of them look at Henry, who considers and then nods. Yes, ma'am, iced tea would be great. So she leads them back to the house where they'll spend so much of their time in the following years, the house at 19 Maple Lane. Only it is really Duddits who leads the way, prancing, skipping, sometimes lifting his yellow Scooby-Doo lunchbox over his head, but always Beaver notices, keeping at almost the same place on the sidewalk, about a foot from the grass margin within the walk and the street. Years later, after the thing with the Rick and Howard girl, he will consider what Mrs. Cavell said. They all will. He sees the line. "Jonesy?" Beaver called. No answer. Christ, it seemed like Jonesy had been gone for a long time. Probably hadn't been, but there was no way Beaver could tell. He'd forgotten to put his watch that morning. Stupid, but then he'd always been stupid. He ought to be used to it by now. Next to Jonesy and Henry, both he and Pete had been stupid. Not that Jonesy and Henry had ever treated them that way. That was one of the great things about them. "Jonesy?" Still nothing. Probably he was having trouble finding the tape. That was all. There was a wild little voice far back in Beaver's head telling him that the tape had nothing to do with it, that Jonesy had gone Powder River, leaving him here to sit on the toilet like Danny Glover in that movie. But he hadn't listened to that voice because Jonesy would never do anything like that. They were friends to the end, always had been. That's right, the vile voice agreed. You are friends, and this is the end. "Jonesy, you there, man?" Still nothing. Maybe the tape had fallen off the nail it had been hung on. Nothing from beneath him either. Hey, it really wasn't possible that McCarthy had shut some kind of a monster into the John, was it? That he'd given birth to the beast in the bowl. It sounded like a horror movie spoof on Saturday Night Live, and even if that happened, the beast in the bowl had probably drowned by now, drowned or gone deep. A line from story suddenly occurred to him, one they'd read to Duddits, taking turns, and it was good when there were four of them because Duddits liked something he'd never got tired of it. "Edool!" Duddits would shout, running to one of them with the look held high over his head, the way he'd carried his lunchbox home that day. "Edool! Edool!" Which in this case meant read pool, read pool. The book was McElligot's Pool by Dr. Seuss. The first memorable couplet, which went, "Young man," argued the farmer, "you're sort of a fool. You'll never catch a fish in McElligot's pool." But there had been fish, at least in the imagination of the little boy in this story. Plenty of fish. Big fish. No splashes from beneath them, though. No bumps on the underside of the lid either. Not for a while now. He could maybe risk one quick look. Just raise the lid a little and slam it back down if anything. "Just sit tight, buddy," was the last thing Jonesy had said to him, and that was what he'd better do. Jonesy's most likely a mile down by the road by now, the vile voice estimated. A mile down the road and still picking up speed. "No, he ain't," Beaver said. "Not Jonesy." He shifted a little bit on the closed seat, waiting for the thing to jump, but it didn't. It might be 60 yards away from now and swimming in the turds in the septic tank. Jonesy had said it was too big to go down, but neither of them had actually seen it. There was no way to tell for sure, was there? But in either case, Monsieur Beaver Clarendon was going to sit right here. Because he'd said he would. Because time always seems slower when you're worried or scared. And because he trusted Jonesy. Jonesy and Henry had never hurt him or made fun, not of him, not of Pete, and none of them had ever hurt Duddits or made fun of him either. Beav snorted laughter. Duddits with its Scooby-Doo lunchbox, Duddits on his belly, blowing the fluff off dandelions, Duddits running around in the backyard, happy as a bird in a tree. Yeah, and people who called kids like him special didn't know half of it. He had been special, all right. They're present, from a fucked up world that usually didn't give you jack shit. Duddits had been their own special thing, and they loved him. They sit in the sunny kitchen nook. The clouds have gone away as if by magic, drinking iced tea and watching Duddits, who drank his Zarex, awful-looking orange stuff, in 3 or 4 huge splattering gulps, and then ran out back to play. Henry does most of the talking, telling Mrs. Cavell that boys were just kinda pushing him around. He says that he got a little bit rough and ripped his shirt, which scared Duddits and made him cry. There is no mention of how Richie Granadu and his friends took off his pants, no mention of the nasty after-school snack they wanted Duddits to eat. And when Mrs. Cavell asks them if they know who these big boys were, Henry hesitates briefly and then says no, just some big boys from the high school. He didn't know any of them, not by name. She looks at Beaver, Jonesy and Pete. They all shake their heads. It may be wrong, dangerous to Duddits in the long run as well, but they can't step far outside the rules which govern their lives. Already Beaver cannot understand where they found the sack to intervene in the first place, and later the others will say the same. They marvel at their courage. They also marvel that they aren't in the fucking hospital. She looks at them sadly for a moment, and Beaver realizes she knows a lot about what they aren't telling. Probably enough to keep her awake that night. Then she smiles. Right at Beaver she smiles and makes him tingle all the way down his toes. "What a lot of zippers you have on your jacket," she says. Beaver smiles. "Yes, ma'am, it's my Fonzie jacket. It was my brother's first. These guys make fun of it, but I like it just the same." "Happy days," she says. "We like it too. Duddits like it. Perhaps you'd like to come over some night and watch it with us, with him." Her smile grows wistful, as if she knows nothing like that will ever happen. "Yeah, that'd be okay," Beaver says. "Actually, it would." Pete agrees. They sit for a little without talking, just watching him play in the backyard. There's a swing set with 2 swings. Duddits runs behind them, pushing them, making the swings go by themselves. Sometimes he stops, crosses his arms over his chest, turns the clockless dial of his face up to the sky, and laughs. "Seems all right now," Jonesy says, and drinks the last of his tea. "Guess he's forgotten all about it." Mrs. Cavell has started to get up, and now she backs down, giving him an almost startled look. "Oh no, not at all," she says. "He remembers, not like you and I, perhaps, but he remembers things. He'll probably have nightmares tonight, and when we go into his room, his father and me, he won't be able to explain. That's the worst for him. He can't tell what it is he sees and thinks and feels. He doesn't have the vocabulary." She sighs. In any case, those boys won't forget him. What if they are laying on him now? What if they are laying for you? "We can take care of ourselves," Jonesy says, but although his voice is not stout enough, his eyes are uneasy. "Maybe," she says, "but what about Duddits? I can walk him to school. I used to, and I suppose I'll have to again. For a while at least, anyway, but he loves to walk home on his own so much. It makes him feel like a big boy," Pete says. She reaches across the table and touches Pete's hand, making him blush. "That's right. It makes him feel like a big boy." "You know," Henry says, "we could walk him. We all could go together to junior high, and it would be easy enough to come down here to Kansas Street." Roberta Cavell only sits there without saying anything, a little birdie woman in a print dress, looking at Henry attentively, like someone waiting for the punchline of a joke. "Would that be okay, Mrs. Cavell?" Beaver asks her, "Because we could do it easy, or maybe you don't want us to?" Something complicated happens to Mrs. Cavell's face. There are all those little twitches, mostly under the skin. One eye almost winks, and then the other one does wink. She takes a handkerchief from her pocket and blows her nose. Beaver thinks she's trying not to laugh at us. But when she tells Henry that, as they're walking home, Jonesy and Pete already dropped off, Henry will look at him at utter astonishment. Cry is what she was trying not to do. She will say, and then, affectionately, after a pause, "Dope." "You would do that?" she asks, and when Henry nods for all of them, she changes the question slightly. "Why would you do that?" Henry looks around as if to say, "Someone else take this one, will ya?" Pete says, "We like him, ma'am." Jonesy is nodding. "I like the way he carries his lunchbox over his head." "Yeah, that's bitching," Pete says. Henry kicks him under the table. Pete replays what he just said. You can see him doing, and begins blushing furiously. Mrs. Cavell appears not to notice. She's looking at Henry with fixed intensity. "He has to go by 8:15, she says. "We're always near here by then," Henry replies. "Aren't we, you guys?" And although 7:45 is in fact a little too early for them, they all nod and say, "Yeah, right, sure, yeah." "You would do that?" she asks again, and this time Beaver had no trouble reading her tone. She is incredi, you know what it is, the word that means you can't fucking believe it. "Sure," Henry says, "unless you think Duddits wouldn't, you know." "Wouldn't want us to," Jonesy finishes. "Are you crazy?" she says. Beaver thinks she is speaking to herself, trying to convince herself that all these boys are really in the kitchen and all of this is in fact happening. Walking to school with the big boys. Boys who go to do what Duddits call real school. He'd think he was in heaven. "Okay," Henry says. "He'll come by 8:15. Walk him to school and we'd walk home with him too." And he gets out at we know the time the Retard Academy gets out, Beaver says cheerfully, and realizes a second before he sees the other stricken faces that he'd said something a lot worse than bitching. He claps his hand over his mouth. Above them, his eyes are huge. Jonesy kicks his shin so hard under the table that Beav almost tumbles over backward. "Don't mind him, ma'am," Henry says. He's talking rapidly, which he does only when he is embarrassed. He's just... "I don't mind," she says. "I know what people call it. Sometimes Alfie and I call it ourselves." This topic incredibly hardly seems to interest her. "Why?" she says again, and although it's Henry she is looking at, it's Beaver who answers in spite of his blazing cheeks. "Because he's cool," he says. The others nod. They will walk Duddits to school and back for the next 5 years or so, unless he is sick or they are at hole in the wall. By the end of it, Duddits is no longer going to Mary M. Snow, aka the Retard Academy, but to Derry Vocational, where he learns to bake cookies, baking 2 T's, and Duddits essay. Replace car batteries, make change, tie his own tie. The knot is always perfect, although it sometimes appears about halfway down his shirt. By then, the Josie Rinkenhauer thing has come and gone, and little 9 days wonder forgotten by everyone except Josie's parents, who will never forget. In those years, they will walk with him to and from his school. Duddits will sprout up until he's the tallest of all of them, a gangly teenager with a strangely beautiful child's face. By then, they will have taught him how to play Parcheesi and a simplified version of Monopoly. By then, they will have him invented the Duddits game and played it incessantly, sometimes laughing so hard that Alfie Cavell, he was the tall one of the pair, but he had a birdie look about him, would come to the head of the stairs in the kitchen, the ones that lead to the recording room, and yell down at them, wanting to know what is going on, what is so funny, and maybe they would try to explain that Duddits had pegged Henry, 14 on a 2-hand, or that Duddits had pegged Pete, 15 backward. But Alfie never seemed to get it. He'd stand there at the head of the stairs with a section of the newspaper in his hand, smiling perplexedly. And at last he'd say the same thing. "Keep it down to a dull row, boys," and close the door, leaving them to their own devices. And of all those devices, the Duddits game was the best. Totally bitching, as Pete would have said. There were times when Beaver thought he might actually laugh, until he exploded, and Duddits sitting there all the time on the rug, beside the big old Parkman cribbage board, feet folded under him and grinning like Buddha. What a fuckery! All of that ahead of them, but now just this kitchen and the surprising sun, and Duddits outside pushing the swings. Duddits who had done them such a favor by coming into their lives. Duddits who is, they know it from the first, not like anyone else they know. I don't see how they could have done it. Pete says suddenly. The way he was crying, I don't see how they could have done on teasing him. Roberta Cavell looks at him sadly. Older boys don't hear him the same way, she says. I hope you never understand.